Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the David Library for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see all of you this afternoon. Thank you. The title of my talk this afternoon is Love and Honor in 1812, Patriotism and Popular Culture in the New United States. On June 19th of 1812, James Madison made a public announcement of the first war ever to be declared in the history of the United States. He said, quote, "I exhort all the good people of the United States, as they love their country, as they feel wrongs, that they exert themselves." Madison's call made clear that the expectation of showing love of country required giving support to the war. At a moment of national crisis, patriotism was needed. He sought to justify the conflict to the population at large and motivate the country to support the war. The stakes were high because although a majority in Congress had voted in favor of declaring war, not one single member of the Federalist Party had voted in support of the war. Northeastern Federalists took a very skeptical view of the war, far more so than did Southern and Western members of the Democratic Republican Party that Madison was leading. Ostensibly a conflict with Britain over national sovereignty, the American War of 1812 very quickly became instead a test, or in addition, a test of the strength and meaning of American patriotism. Now, we often tend to forget about the War of 1812. It's easy to lose track of it between the glory of the revolutionary independence movement and the really transformative carnage of the Civil War. But the War of 1812 does enjoy a certain dubious distinction of its own, and that is that it was the first war ever to be formally declared in a modern democracy. In a democracy, public opinion matters. Politicians gain and maintain power through the approval of the populace. So, in strict military and diplomatic terms, the War of 1812 may not have accomplished very much. By the war's end in 1815, the British had burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground. The national debt had nearly tripled from 45 million to 127 million. And all that the United States had accomplished was getting the British to agree to maintain the status quo ante bellum, that is, to keep all matters of diplomatic dispute exactly in the same status that they had had before the war. All territorial boundaries, all trade questions, everything was going to just stay exactly the same. Yet somehow, the population at large regarded this war with favor. The war received a sort of a popular referendum in the presidential elections of 1812 and 1816. Madison easily won re-election in November of 1812 in the early months of the war, and his hand-picked successor and former Secretary of War, James Monroe, enjoyed landslide success 4 years later. Hundreds of thousands of men cast votes for the Democratic-Republican Party in those contests. The war, in other words, proved to be a rousing popular success. How did people come to form their opinions about this war? Well, usually not through direct observation. Far many more people in the United States read and wrote about the War of 1812 than fought in it. And I'll just give you some numbers to give you a sense of this. The nation lost just 2,260 men in battle in the War of 1812. That was less than 0.5% of all servicemen. Many who served in local militias and had a service that was more ceremonial than actual. By contrast, 617,000 combatants died in the Civil War, just to give you a sense of the difference in scale that we're talking about. Statistics like these hint that the meaning of the War of 1812 can be found as much in popular prints, in newspapers, books, and ballads telling about the war as it can be found in the battlefields themselves. Contrast those numbers of servicemen with numbers on newspapers. Between 1812 and 1815, the nation's presses produced approximately 250 different newspaper titles, from the South Carolina State Gazette to the Kentucky Telegraph to the Massachusetts Weekly Messenger. That's about one newspaper franchise for every 10 men who died in battle. We're not talking about how many volumes of the newspapers were published weekly or monthly in that period, how many issues of each volume. We're talking about how many actual different newspaper franchises there were, quite a few. So if we truly want to assess the impact and the importance of of the War of 1812, I don't know where that came from, we need to evaluate it as a cultural event as much as a military one. Now, in 1812, Americans took instructions about patriotism from a flood of popular prints, awash in discussions about national love. From political speeches like Madison's to tavern ballads and folk songs, from learned treatises of political economy to popular novels and plays, Americans on every side of the war question proved eager to talk about love of country. A war that might easily have been dismissed as a terrific waste of time and money, if not deplored as a disastrous display of hubris, instead sparked what one newspaper famously described as an era of good feelings. As Madison's claim on those who loved their country and felt her wrongs made clear, emotion became central to the war's appraisal. Everything was to be contemplated through the lens of patriotic love. Now, throughout the War of 1812, popular conclusions about the meaning of events were liable to be based more on the emotional language used to describe them than on rational appraisal of what had occurred. Whereas Europeans continued to declare that their love of country grew out of a childlike devotion to father kings, and whereas American and French sons of liberty had fought revolutions against monarchs from what they called motives of brotherly love, Americans in 1812 emphasized that their patriotism grew from yet another variety of familial affection, the romantic love between courting couples. Consider, for example, the songsters who raised their voices in chorus in a ballad called The Love of Country that appeared in a publication called the National Songbook in 1813. The lyrics explained, "A soldier is a gentleman. His honor is his life. And he that won't stand to his post will never stand by his wife. Since love and honor are the same, or are so near allied, that neither can exist alone, but flourish side by side. Then farewell, sweethearts, for a while, ye pretty girls, adieu, and when we've drove the British dogs, we'll kiss it out with you." So there you have the title of my talk, Love and Honor. With that promise that love and honor are the same, men and women alike were told that there was a fundamental connection between romantic attachments and national loyalties. Lovers made the best soldiers, and vice versa, soldiers made the best lovers. In the era of the War of 1812, war stories and love stories were seriously intertwined, so much so that to us it now seems humorous. But the links between war and romance were literal as well as figurative. The patriotism that we might today jokingly sum up as love, marriage, and the baby carriage had a practical effect, and that was to foster spectacular population expansion. High rates of marriage and reproduction resulted in the exponential growth of the American population. And this had significant implications for the nation's success in military contests, not only with the British, but also with Native Americans. In an age when starting a family usually meant clearing a farm, enhancements in the size of the population and expansion of the territory of the nation went hand in hand. In fact, although the United States won no changes in British policy as a result of the war, the country did gain undisputed control of Western lands that had once been claimed by Indians. These were lands that would soon be settled by whites and cultivated in substantial part by enslaved men and women. Now, what this means is that